Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive with us.
Yeah, it's great to be back.
And today we're going to be taking a look at Beliefs of Thinkers by Abbas Mahmoud Al-Aqqad.
That's right. This is originally published in 1948, and it presents a really fascinating 20th century perspective on religious doctrine.
Okay, so, and I know you've been looking into this quite a bit. What exactly was Al-Aqqad trying to do with this book?
So Al-Aqqad's main goal was to try and offer a really comprehensive answer to all these different viewpoints on belief.
Okay.
But he was looking at it specifically through all of the advancements that came out of the 20th century
Right.
in terms of science and moral philosophy.
Okay, and so who are some of the thinkers whose beliefs he's exploring in this book?
Well, he's got quite a range, actually.
Okay.
He's got scientists, writers, philosophers,
Right.
even some figures from the existentialist movement.
Really?
So it's really a sort of tapestry of different perspectives on this really fundamental topic.
Okay, so a lot of interesting voices to listen to. And now I know that Al-Aqqad was really specific about focusing on 20th century thinkers, right?
Absolutely.
He didn't really want to bring in folks whose ideas kind of predated some of the big scientific discoveries and the shifts in moral thinking that happened during this period.
Yeah, that's exactly right. He was really interested in those fresh justifications for belief that came out of the advancements of the 20th century. So
Yeah.
he specifically left out thinkers whose arguments hadn't really evolved in light of those discoveries.
So those who hadn't really grappled with this kind of new landscape of knowledge.
Exactly.
Okay, now the introduction to the book has this image that really struck me.
Oh, yeah.
It's the analogy of these magnetic needles on ships navigating an unknown ocean.
That's right.
Could you kind of break that down for us?
So he uses that analogy to show all the different viewpoints among the thinkers that he discusses.
Okay.
So imagine you have, all these different ships, each with a compass and a magnetic needle.
Great.
They're all sailing on this uncharted sea,
Yeah.
an unknown ocean. And their needles, they might point in slightly different directions. Some might waver a bit.
Okay.
Some might be more steady. But in the end, they're all drawn towards the same magnetic pole. And that pole represents belief.
So what he's saying is that even though these thinkers might have very different perspectives, different approaches, they're all ultimately seeking that same thing, that same kind of core truth or belief.
Exactly. And what really fascinates him is that despite all these variations and hesitations, that underlying human desire for belief remains constant.
It's a universal human impulse.
Yeah, I think that's what he's getting at.
Okay, now in that first chapter of the book, Al-Aqqad poses this question that we're really going to dig into today, and it's a big one. What exactly is this religious doctrine that these Western thinkers were either looking for or questioning in the 20th century?
Exactly. And before we can really understand their, explorations or even their critiques of religious doctrine,
Yeah.
we need to understand what they considered like the core of it to be.
Right, we need to define our terms. Okay, so where does Al-Aqqad begin to kind of map out what this religious doctrine meant to these 20th century thinkers?
He starts by looking at Julian Huxley, the biologist.
Oh, okay.
And in the introduction to this collection of essays called Science and Religion,
Okay.
Huxley, he really emphasizes this fundamental unity
Okay.
underneath all these different levels of religious doctrine that are out there.
Okay.
And for him, he really boils it down to the feeling of holiness.
The feeling of holiness.
Yeah, so the deepest foundation, the
Flavor.
essence of anything that we could call religious
Okay.
is this feeling, this subjective experience of the sacred.
And it's interesting because Al-Aqqad points out that Huxley's view here, kind of prioritizes that emotional experience over a more kind of detailed historical analysis of different religious traditions.
That's right.
So it's less about the specifics and more about that core feeling.
Exactly. It's about that inner experience.
Okay, so it's not so much about the rules or the theology, it's about this feeling of holiness.
Yeah, that's how Al-Aqqad interprets Huxley in this context.
Okay.
And then he goes on to look at Professor Gordon Allport, who is a psychologist from Harvard.
Mm-hmm.
And in his book, The Individual in His Religion, Allport makes a really crucial distinction
Okay.
between faith and belief.
Now, that's interesting because those two terms are often used kind of interchangeably.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's why Allport felt it was so important to differentiate them.
Okay, so what is the key difference that Allport draws between faith and belief?
So according to Allport, faith is all about surrender
Okay.
and a deep and fervent feeling.
Okay.
Whereas belief, that can involve reasons
Okay.
and evidence and a sense of likelihood,
Okay.
even if that likelihood is just an estimation.
Okay.
He says that faith ventures knowingly.
Ventures knowingly.
Yeah, so it steps forward with this strong sense of confidence in a valuable outcome,
Okay.
even if you don't have absolute certainty.
I see. So faith has that element of trust,
Yes,
of
exactly.
commitment, even without concrete proof, whereas belief seems to be more grounded in a reasoned assessment of what's probable.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a really helpful distinction.
I think so.
So faith is about taking that leap, and belief is about weighing the evidence.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay, now, Al-Aqqad then shares Allport's analysis of the writings of St. Thomas à Kempis.
Okay.
And what does Allport find there?
Well, Allport observed this kind of inclusiveness
Okay.
of religious reliance in Kempis's writings. And what I mean by that is that
Yeah.
he suggests that the soul is looking for a sense of wholeness
Okay.
when it turns towards its deity.
It's seeking completion.
Yes. And he also sees this exploratory or inductive nature
Okay.
in Kempis's ideas. And that suggests that a sound religious doctrine should actually help to alleviate anxieties
Okay.
and lead to both knowledge and virtuous behavior.
So it's almost like a practical test for a religious doctrine.
Mhm.
Does it actually lead to greater understanding and inner peace?
Exactly. Does it actually make a positive difference in your life?
Okay, so building on all of this, Al-Aqqad then puts together this kind of contemporary understanding
Right.
of the essential elements of religious doctrine
Yes.
as it was being seen in the 20th century.
Mhm.
And what does he come up with?
So he says that the modern mind
Okay.
tended to require a supernatural force
Okay.
with authority over the natural world.
Okay, so something beyond the laws of physics as we understand them.
Exactly. And this force has to be capable of inspiring glorification
Okay.
and worship.
So it's not just about power, it's about deserving that kind of reverence?
That's right. And this force is generally thought of as a complete spirit
Okay.
or a complete mind.
Okay.
So something fundamentally higher
Okay.
and beyond any limitations of space and time.
So not just a powerful being, but like a supreme intelligence.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. A complete and perfect being.
Okay, now Al-Aqqad also delves into the psychological dimension of belief.
Right.
And I found this really fascinating.
Yeah, it's a key part of his exploration.
So tell me about some of the feelings that he highlights as being connected to this idea of belief.
Okay, so he talks about things like joy.
Okay.
A kind of joy that can really elevate the mind beyond its ordinary state.
Okay.
And also a deep sense of gratitude,
Okay.
so profound that it needs to find a worthy recipient,
Okay.
sometimes even directing itself, to something beyond the human realm, like to the distant star, as he puts it.
It's like that gratitude is so big, it needs something bigger than just a person to receive it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And he does acknowledge
Yeah.
that these feelings, as powerful as they are,
Yeah.
could be seen as a happy illusion.
A happy illusion.
Yeah, that's his term.
Okay. But he doesn't stop there, right?
Yeah, he doesn't.
Yeah.
He doesn't think that psychology alone
Okay.
can explain the whole phenomenon of religion.
Right.
He argues that religion comes from both our internal needs as humans
Okay.
and our external experiences.
Right.
So things like the awe that we feel when we encounter the power of nature, the impact of major crises in our lives,
Okay.
that sense of some kind of underlying perfection.
Mm.
All of these things contribute
Okay.
to the emergence of religious belief.
Okay, so it's not just coming from inside us.
Right.
It's also being triggered by these external events.
Exactly.
And I like how he distinguishes religious awe from just fear.
Yes, that's an important distinction.
He says it's this blend of fear, astonishment, admiration,
Right.
and the sense that we're actually quite insignificant.
Within this much larger order.
Yeah, it's that feeling of being part of something so much bigger than yourself.
Exactly.
Okay, now Al-Aqqad also points out something that seems kind of paradoxical.
Okay.
He says that while religion can make us feel humble,
Right.
because we're contemplating the vastness of the universe and the perfection of God, it can also give us this sense of dignity.
Yeah, that's an interesting point.
So how does he explain that?
Well, he argues that this dignity comes from our capacity to know God, to connect with the Creator, and also from the possibility of immortality.
Right.
He even brings in Plato's idea
Okay.
that the human mind has the potential to grasp these eternal truths.
Okay, so it's both humbling and elevating at the same time.
Exactly.
We realize how small we are,
Yeah.
but also how significant we could be.
Precisely.
Okay, now shifting gears a little bit. Al-Aqqad then talks about the 20th century itself
All right.
and how it relates to the idea of belief.
Right.
And he makes this really intriguing argument.
Yeah.
He says that the defining characteristic of the 20th century isn't actually a widespread certainty in belief,
Right.
but rather something he calls doubt in denial.
Yeah, that's one of the core ideas of the book.
Doubt and denial.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what exactly does he mean by that?
So he's saying that the reasons that people used to deny religious doctrine in earlier centuries,
Okay.
like in the 17th century, for example, those reasons weren't holding up anymore.
They weren't convincing anymore.
Exactly. Not with the same strength. Not in the face of all the scientific progress of the 20th century.
Okay, so the intellectual ground had shifted.
Absolutely. The old certainties were crumbling.
Okay, could you give us an example of this?
Sure. So take the power of reason, which was so dominant in the 19th century.
Okay.
By the 20th century, reason itself had been humbled a bit
Okay.
by its own limitations,
Okay.
especially when it came to explaining things like ultimate purposes and origins.
So reason alone couldn't answer the big questions anymore?
Exactly. And then science itself in the early 20th century
Mm-hmm.
started to recognize its own inherent limitations,
Okay.
particularly when it came to these big existential questions.
Okay, so science was becoming more aware of its boundaries.
Precisely. It was becoming less dogmatic.
Okay.
Al-Aqqad points out this emerging scientific consensus
Okay.
that explaining these fundamental causes, explaining the why of things,
Yeah.
that might actually be beyond the scope of science.
Interesting. So science was becoming less about proving or disproving God.
Exactly. It was becoming more about description, comparison, analysis.
Okay.
But those deeper questions, those were still open.
Right.
He contrasts this with earlier periods
Okay.
where scientists sometimes felt like they could just say yes or no about religious beliefs
Yeah.
based on their scientific findings.
Right.
But in the 20th century, very few reputable scientists
Okay.
were making those kinds of claims anymore.
So it was less about science versus religion
Right.
and more about recognizing that science couldn't provide all the answers.
Exactly.
Okay, so Al-Aqqad is really clear that this doubt and denial
Right.
doesn't automatically mean that everyone suddenly started believing.
No, not at all.
It just means that those who are denying religious doctrines,
Yes.
they couldn't do it with the same level of confidence anymore.
Precisely their reasons were becoming less certain.
Okay, that's a really fascinating way to think about the intellectual climate of the 20th century.
I think so.
It's like the foundations of denial were themselves becoming shaky. Okay, so having established this idea of doubt in denial,
Right.
Al-Aqqad then looks at the specific challenges that 20th century thought presented to traditional religious beliefs,
That's right.
and he outlines several key areas
Mm-hmm.
where traditional doctrines were facing scrutiny.
Yes.
So what's the first one he addresses?
So the first challenge he talks about is Copernicus's heliocentric model.
Okay. The idea that the Earth revolves around the sun.
Exactly. And this had a huge impact
Okay.
on the anthropocentric view.
Okay, so the idea that humanity and the Earth are at the center of everything.
Exactly.
And this shift naturally led to questions about human significance
Right.
and purpose.
If we're not at the physical center of the universe,
Yeah.
then where do we fit in? What's our role?
What's the point of it all?
Yeah, those are big
It's
questions.
huge questions.
But Al-Aqqad brings up this really important counter-argument
Okay.
that I think is often missed.
Okay.
He points out that scriptural religions themselves
Okay.
didn't actually insist on a belief in an immobile earth
Okay.
at the center of everything.
Right.
The conflict really came from these ingrained habits of thought
Okay.
and misinterpretations that were rooted in Aristotle and Ptolemy.
So those ancient Greek thinkers
Exactly.
and their ideas about the cosmos.
Right. Their geocentric model.
And it's interesting that Al-Aqqad mentions that even Copernicus himself
Yeah.
was troubled by the implications of his own discoveries.
I know. It's fascinating, isn't it?
He was challenging centuries of established thought.
Exactly.
So it wasn't really a direct conflict with the core ideas of faith.
Right.
It was more a conflict with a specific cosmological model
It's a good way to put it.
that had become attached to those beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now the book also highlights these really specific prerequisites
Right.
for life on Earth.
Yeah.
You know, things like the Earth's size,
Yeah.
its distance from the sun.
The composition of the atmosphere.
Exactly.
All of these things are so finely tuned
Yeah.
that it seems remarkable.
Right.
that life is even
It's
possible.
like a cosmic miracle.
Yeah, and Al-Aqqad even touches on those old scientific debates
Okay.
about the possibility of life on Mars.
Oh, right.
Like the different views of Spencer Jones and Arrhenius and Jeans.
Well, those were big names at the time.
They were.
And it really shows how even as our understanding of the universe was expanding,
Right.
the uniqueness of our own planet
Yeah.
seemed even more amazing.
Precisely.
Okay, so that's the first challenge, the heliocentric model.
Right.
Now, what's the next big challenge that Al-Aqqad talks about?
So the second challenge comes from our evolving understanding of the laws of matter.
Okay.
And this is a big one
Okay.
because it involves a shift from thinking about matter as a tangible, solid substance
Right.
to the realm of mathematical calculations.
Okay, so a move towards the abstract.
Exactly. And this is really driven by the work of physicists like Planck,
Okay.
Heisenberg, and Schrödinger.
Those are huge names in physics.
Yeah, they revolutionized our understanding of reality.
Okay, so tell me a bit more about this shift.
Sure. So Al-Aqqad explains these principles of quantum theory,
Okay.
which shows this inherent probability
Okay.
at the subatomic level.
Okay.
And he points out that our measurements and our formulations of natural laws, they're always going to be approximate
Okay.
because there are just so many particles interacting.
Right.
But this probabilistic nature,
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily negate the idea of causality.
Okay, so things still happen for a reason.
Right, but the reasons might be more complex
Okay.
than we can fully grasp.
Okay, so it's not that the universe is random.
Right.
It's that it's governed by rules that are beyond our complete comprehension.
Exactly.
Okay, so what was the impact of this shift on how people thought about matter?
Well, it really challenged the idea
Yeah.
of matter as this solid, predictable thing.
Okay.
It became much more fluid,
Okay.
much more abstract.
Okay.
Al-Aqqad even calls it mathematical operations.
Mathematical operations.
Yeah.
So instead of thinking of atoms as these tiny billiard balls,
Right.
we're now thinking of them as these kind of fuzzy clouds of probability.
Exactly. And this shift
Okay.
opened the door for more abstract and non-material concepts.
Because matter itself was no longer this concrete barrier.
Exactly. It was becoming more like an idea.
Right.
Al-Aqqad mentions James Jeans,
Okay.
who suggested that the universe showed signs of a controlling mathematical mind,
Okay.
and Arthur Eddington,
Yeah.
who stressed the importance of religious feeling and belief
Yeah.
as a creative force even within science.
So even some scientists were starting to see connections.
Between their work and these spiritual ideas.
Okay. Fascinating.
Yeah.
So the second challenge is this shift in our understanding of matter
Exactly.
from the concrete to the abstract.
Right.
Now, what's the third big challenge that Al-Aqqad brings up?
So the third challenge is Darwin's theory of evolution.
Okay, this is a big one,
It is.
and it caused a lot of controversy.
It certainly did.
So how does Al-Aqqad approach this?
Well, he starts by emphasizing that both Darwin and Wallace were not atheists.
Okay, so that's a common misconception,
It is.
that evolution equals atheism.
Right.
But Al-Aqqad is saying that's not accurate.
Exactly. He points out that Darwin himself acknowledged the concept of a creator,
Okay.
and he saw evolution as explaining the diversity of species,
Okay.
not as explaining the ultimate origin of life itself.
Right. So evolution could be seen as a process within a larger divine plan.
Exactly.
Okay.
And Al-Aqqad actually shares Darwin's later views,
Okay.
where Darwin himself said that it was a huge error
Okay.
to infer atheism from his theory.
So Darwin himself was pushing back against that interpretation.
That's right. He didn't see his theory as inherently anti-religious.
Okay.
And Al-Aqqad also notes that by the 20th century, most evolutionists
Okay.
weren't using the theory to deny religious belief.
Okay.
And many religious people had found ways to reconcile their faith with evolution.
Okay.
So that perceived conflict from the 19th century
Right.
was becoming less stark in the 20th century.
Yeah. It was becoming more nuanced.
Exactly. People were finding ways to hold both ideas
Okay.
without seeing them as contradictory.
And Al-Aqqad also points out that even within science itself,
Right.
evolution wasn't considered to be completely settled.
No, there were still debates
Okay.
about certain aspects of it.
So it wasn't like a done deal.
Not at all. It was still evolving as a theory.
Right. So the third challenge is evolution.
Yes.
And Al-Aqqad shows how that relationship between evolution and religion was becoming more complex in the 20th century.
Exactly. It was more nuanced conversation.
Okay, so what's the fourth big challenge he discusses?
So the fourth challenge came from the study of comparative religion
Okay.
and worship.
Okay.
And as scholars started studying different religions from around the world,
Right.
they found all these similarities.
Okay, like what kind of similarities?
Well, similarities in rituals, beliefs,
Right.
ethical teachings.
Okay.
And this led some materialist thinkers.
Okay. those who believe that only the material world exists.
Exactly. To argue that religion was just a human construct.
Okay, so not divinely inspired,
Right.
but just something that humans came up with.
Exactly. Maybe arising from some shared psychological need.
Okay, so if different cultures independently developed similar beliefs,
Right.
maybe that suggests a common human origin
Exactly.
rather than a single divine source.
Right. But Al-Aqqad also presents the counter-argument
Okay.
from religious thinkers
Okay.
who said that these similarities
Yeah.
could actually be echoes of some ancient original revelation
Okay.
that got diversified over time.
So it's like a branching out
Yes.
from a single source.
Right.
And maybe some of that original clarity got lost along the way.
Exactly.
Okay, that's a fascinating debate
It is.
about the origins of religious beliefs.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the fourth challenge, comparative religion.
Right.
Now, what's the final challenge that Al-Aqqad addresses?
So the final challenge, and this is a big one,
Okay.
is the problem of evil.
Yeah, the age-old question. If God is good and all-powerful,
Right.
why is there so much suffering in the world?
That's the question.
And Al-Aqqad argues that this problem became even more acute
Right.
in the 20th century.
Because of the two world wars.
Right. The scale of violence and suffering was just unimaginable.
It was. And there was also this heightened sense of moral accountability.
Right. People were starting to hold each other
Yes.
and institutions to a higher moral standard.
Exactly.
Okay.
So he revisits this classic question
Okay.
of how can evil exist
Yeah.
if God is merciful and all-powerful?
Mm-hmm.
And he notes this historical tendency
Okay.
to just accept God's will.
Okay. Like saying it's beyond our understanding.
Right.
Oh.
But he says that in the 20th century,
Yeah.
there was this greater willingness to question,
Okay.
to really wrestle with this paradox.
People weren't content with simple answers anymore.
Exactly. They
Yeah.
wanted deeper explanations.
Okay. So what are some of the responses to the problem of evil
Okay.
that Al-Aqqad explores?
So he talks about the idea that we need differences
Okay.
to appreciate goodness.
Okay. So we need darkness to see the light.
Right. And then there's the idea that good can come out of evil.
Oh,
Like how wartime competition
Yeah.
can lead to technological advancements.
Okay. Like inventions that might have other uses.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he also talks about the idea of shared responsibility
Okay.
between those who govern and those who are governed.
Okay.
So it's not just God's fault.
Right.
Humans have a role to play as well.
Right. We have free will and we make choices.
Exactly.
Okay. And what else?
He also explores the notion that evil can highlight the value of good,
Okay.
that it makes us appreciate goodness more.
Okay. So without evil, we wouldn't truly understand the importance of good.
That's the idea.
Okay. Now, Al-Aqqad even brings up the idea
Mm.
that the existence of evil might not negate a perfect God,
Right.
but could instead point to limitations within creation.
Yes, or even a necessary component of a greater good.
Okay, so evil might have a purpose that we don't fully understand.
Exactly. And he uses this analogy of chess,
Okay.
where challenges and complexities can actually make the game more interesting.
Right, so in a way, evil could be seen as adding depth to the human experience.
That's one way to think about it.
Okay.
And he also raises the possibility that the problem of evil might actually point to the need for an afterlife.
Okay, so that injustices can be resolved.
Exactly. And that ultimate justice can be served.
Okay, so those are the 5 big challenges
Right.
that Al-Aqqad sees 20th century thought presenting to traditional religious beliefs.
Exactly. And he explores each one in detail.
Okay, so now we've set the stage with these challenges.
Mhm.
Let's dive into how different thinkers in the 20th century actually approached belief itself.
Okay, sounds good.
So who does Al-Aqqad start with?
He starts with the believing scientists.
Okay, the scientists who held religious beliefs.
Exactly. And he gives some really interesting examples.
Okay, so tell me about some of those examples.
So one example is Alexis Carrel, who was a Nobel Prize-winning biologist.
Okay, so a very credible scientific voice.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And Carrel, he viewed God as being as essential to human well-being
Okay.
as water and oxygen.
Wow, so a pretty fundamental need.
That's how he saw it.
Okay.
And he actually linked materialism to mental imbalance.
Really?
Yeah, and moral decline.
Okay, so for him, believing only in the material world
Right.
was actually harmful.
Yes, he saw it as detrimental to human flourishing.
Okay. And what else did Carroll believe?
Well, he really emphasized the sacred aspect of existence.
Okay.
And he saw that as being tied to humility,
Okay.
especially humility in prayer.
Okay.
And he was a big advocate
Okay.
for developing all aspects of the human being,
Okay.
not just the physical body and the intellect,
Right.
but also the emotions and the spirit.
So a holistic view of the human person?
Exactly. He was against reducing humans to just machines.
Okay, so that's Carroll.
Right.
Now, who else does Al-Aqqad discuss?
Another interesting example is Pierre Lecomte Dunois.
Okay.
He was a French biophysicist and philosopher.
Okay, so a scientist who also engaged in philosophical thinking.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he viewed belief as a kind of mystery,
Okay.
similar to the mystery of life itself.
Okay, so something that can't be fully explained by logic alone.
Exactly.
Okay. And what was his approach to belief?
Well, he really liked this motto
Okay.
from the Spanish philosopher Miguel de Unamuno,
Okay.
which was, believing in God is desiring his existence and acting on that assumption.
Okay, so it's not just about intellectual assent.
Right.
It's about living as if God exists.
Exactly. It's a way of being in the world.
Okay, that's a really powerful idea.
It is.
So we've got Carroll Dunois,
Yes,
and I know Al-Aqqad mentions a bunch of other scientists as well.
he does. He mentions Robert Broom, who was a paleontologist,
Okay.
William Brown, who was a psychologist,
Mm-hmm.
Arthur Thompson, a biologist,
Okay.
and a Professor Gordon.
Okay.
And all of these scientists from very different fields
Right.